did it. He proposed.
He did it.
A federal. All
right, shut up, Papa Gut. All right. So I've been wanting to talk about this for a little while now. Let me see something actually. Ooh, I want to talk about this for a while now. About 3 weeks ago, I made this take over here about the $15 an hour minimum wage increase, and I'm gonna play the take, and then I want to give some contestment to these arguments. A lot of leftists have been having absolute fucking meltdowns over what I've been saying. It's very funny, and there hasn't been a singular person who brought up a good point. They're probably some of the most ignorant, ridiculous points I mean, like, honestly, like, nobody said. So here's the point that you could come at when it comes to $15 an hour minimum wage and make a reasonable point. You could say, hey, overall, the $15 an hour minimum wage would perform well, and it would help like 20-something million Americans. Right? That's what you could have said. There's like a government statistic that talks about how it's going to, provide more money for particular people. Blah 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 blah. But at the same time, it's also going to estimate it. The same estimates that says it's going to be positive for like 20-something million people. It's also going to cause a 1.3 million job loss. A job loss. Like 1.3 million people are estimated to lose their jobs over this $15 an hour increase. So your best argument is like, hey, I think it's better than nothing or something like that. It's fine. All right. I still disagree with it. And the first thing that I've noticed about every single person who duetted it, especially every single one of these leftists, is that they forgot the ending of the video, which is, I support UBI as an alternative. So I'm going to assume that either these people don't watch my videos fully, which means that you really have no say on anything. Like, it's totally fine if you disagree with me, but if you can't watch a minute-long video, you probably shouldn't be providing commentary to anybody. Like, just watch the full video. But you guys kind of just used me as a way to, like, vent about how much you love $15 an hour minimum wage, and I guess also, ironically, capitalism, which is so weird. Because I think UBI can function in capitalism, but it's not like a traditional capitalist. It's not like a traditional, like, capitalism solution. And at the end, I talk about thinking outside of the box. And it's so crazy that all these, like, communists and socialists ejaculate all over the fact that, like, this minimum wage increase. But then if I propose a solution that isn't traditionally capitalist, when they're anti-capitalist, they just don't listen to it. It's funny. It's actually very funny and very ignorant. So let's watch the video, and then we're gonna get into, like, I'm just gonna debunk some of the ridiculous common talking points. So here we go.
So Biden did it. He proposed a federal minimum wage increase to $15 an hour by 2025, and also $15 an hour for tipped workers by 2026. Just letting you know, I'm not going to be tipping you any longer if this passes. And
it's really funny. A lot of people had a meltdown over the fact that I said I'm not going to tip anymore. I just want you guys to understand that, like, tip culture probably shouldn't be a thing. If you work a job that requires you to tip to live, like, that seems like a flaw in the job. So this idea that I should this idea that I should still tip if the idea of increasing the minimum wage to $15 an hour is to create a livable wage is ridiculous. Why would I do that? If it's a livable wage, why would I tip the guy who serves me dinner if he's making $15 an hour and my prices are going to increase for my dinner anyway? But, like, should I start tipping the McDonald's worker as well? Like, where does it stop? I think that America, like, they don't tip in Europe. I'm pretty sure they don't tip in China or anything. Like, I think we're one of the few countries that has a tipping culture. And, like, when you really break it down, tipping is just bizarre. Like, it's weird. I understand it's like, hey, you give them extra money based on how well they provided a service. And I understand some jobs love getting tipped. I'm not saying eradicate tipping. What I'm saying is that, like, why are you so dependent on the tip? Like, why do we have jobs that are so dependent on, like, tips to live? It's bizarre. Again, if you think that $15 an hour, an increase to that is like a livable wage, why the fuck do I need to tip you anyway? So anyway, let's continue.
While some are very happy about it, most aren't because they understand
I am for a $1,500 an hour minimum wage. Yeah.
and the implications. One of two things will happen. Either small businesses won't be able to afford it and they're going to go out of business, or big businesses that can afford it are going to turn to automation faster, causing job loss. And if you're someone who says, hey, you shouldn't be able to run a business if you can't afford to pay someone a livable wage, that sounds nice on paper, but the execution means more monopolies because, again, small businesses can't compete. Now, I just want you guys to understand something. I am for people being paid a livable wage, but I'm also understanding that within this system, this isn't going to help. It's going to make things worse. If you want to combat massive wealth disparity and rampant poverty while we have billionaires, you need to come up with more clever solutions, like universal basic income. So Biden...
So like at least a quarter of my video was, hey, I think this is crazy. A quarter of the video, like a literal quarter, if not more, of my video was, hey, UBI. And people just like forgot that part. And this is what I'm talking about. This is what I'm talking about. It's a bunch of ignorant leftists that for whatever reason, they're more for us. This is crazy to me. They're more for a system that works within capitalism than a clever outside the box solution, right? It's like I said, I think that people deserve a livable income regardless of the job you're working. And they're like, no, Papa Gut, I don't fucking agree. So just so you guys know, a UBI is $1,000 a month to everybody 18 or older in the United States. I have extensive videos about it. You can go and you can look at them. I have a very strong case for universal basic income. Very strong case. And yes, it comes from Andrew Yang. Yeah. So let's go through some of like the common talking points. Very, very silly common talking points. The first of which is this insane argument that people are making. They're like, they talk about what the minimum wage should be. They'll say something like, this is a crazy argument, right? They'll say something like, well, if the people should be making like $25 an hour if you adjust for productivity. It's something like that, right? They say based on productivity, people should be making $25 an hour. Now, for context, if we actually raise the minimum wage based on inflation, the last time we raised it was in 2009. It was $7.25. It would be $8.84 now in 2021. Secondly, the increase of productivity is mostly due to automation, right? Like there's definitely wage stagnation, but most of it's automation. Somehow people think that people became twice as productive. I don't know how you think this. Over the past, 40 or 50 years. No, that's when like technology started heavily displacing jobs. The productivity is coming from automation. That's where most of the productivity is coming from. And that's one of the things that UBI does so great against, right? You get paid regardless of whether you're working because automation is displacing jobs. Like this is why if you get your mind rolling, you'll understand why I'm for UBI, right? So there's this weird thing where people are like, there's no proof that this $15 an hour minimum wage increase will cause loss of jobs. Well, first of all, in like the government report, there was an estimated 1.3 million jobs lost. So you're just incorrect. Secondly, it's so funny. They reference like areas with small minimum wage increases. And they're like because they got a $1 increase in minimum wage, all of a sudden you can somehow conflate a small increase in minimum wage to a drastic, almost more than double minimum wage increase. They're like, yeah, this place went from $11 to $12 an hour, and they didn't experience this job loss, so you're wrong. It's like, well, we're talking federally, not individually. We're talking about federally, an increase, a double, right? What you have to understand is that areas with like minimum wage increases where it works, where they have higher minimum wages, it's because those are areas that are already successful and they have a solid financial infrastructure. It's something that people don't understand. The reason why states should be able to choose like their own minimum wage increase is usually because they have a better understanding of what the minimum wage increase they can afford. I understand the system's flawed, but like you have to understand that there are poor areas, just so you guys know, that can't handle this. And that's probably the biggest thing that people don't understand. A lot of leftists really don't understand this point, right? Generally speaking, conservatives are very individually focused. They're focused on individuality, and progressives are focused very heavily on like society. These are two perspectives that we need to maintain within context because they're both very powerful and helpful perspectives. When we look at the issue, if we look at it generally, if we look at this as a general issue, right? We would say that a $15 an hour minimum wage increase would have a better impact, right? It is still a net gain technically based on the projections that the government has come out with. However, the negatives of a $15 an hour minimum wage increase are negatives that are going to more negatively or disproportionately impact poor areas. So we're implementing this increase to help poor people, but the towns are going to get hit the hardest are towns that can't afford it, small businesses who can't afford it. Okay, you need to understand that, right? So it's like, yeah, it'll work for most people, but then poor people are going to get poorer because of this, because they don't have the financial infrastructure to pay people $15 an hour. Okay, now again, that's why I'm for universal basic income, because it provides economic infrastructure to poor areas that can't afford it. Okay, but again, people are going to the most negatively impacted people are going to be people who need it the most. That's why we need to look at this in a little bit of a more of an individual perspective. Okay, now the best argument that I've heard that's still a pro $15 an hour minimum wage argument is government subsidized $15 an hour. If you can't, like, if a small business simply can't afford it, then they can implement this. But that to me is micromanagement, and like I just don't know how the federal government, what standard are they going to set for like when it comes to this type of like situation. Again, that's why I'm for UBI. Very simple, very simple. Okay. Lastly, people talk about like the other ways to bolster small businesses. And like I just said before, I don't like micromanagement. One of the biggest things I like about UBI is it's very simple and it's hard for the government to fuck it up. You collect money and you redistribute the wealth. And there's going to be some issues that we're going to have to deal with. Like, for instance, specifically increases from like landowners to like people who rent apartments. But we can come up with like rent control solutions. I like the idea of people getting money and then spending it how they please, right? The government collects the money, gives it to people, individuals. They can spend it how they want. It's freedom of choice with money. That's why I like UBI. I don't want a system. It's like, well, let's increase the minimum wage to $15 an hour, and then let's also like do this thing where, because some people are like solutions like, yeah, like what if we had big businesses closed on the weekends so only small businesses were open? And it's like that just hurts the consumer. I like simple, powerful solutions. I don't like government micromanagement, and I think that like there's nothing wrong with believing that the government doesn't exactly do the greatest job when it comes to solutions. It's crazy that nobody came at me with an actual good argument. I really think a lot of you guys, which is totally fine that you disagree. It's totally fine. It's totally fine. Like, bro, I literally mentioned in like a third or a quarter of my video about universal basic income, and people decided to ignore it. They were like, oh, let me go Google statistics that supports my claim, even though those are like dishonest statistics. But you guys couldn't just do one of these? Check this out. Hey, universal basic income. Oh, that's interesting. That's all you really had to do. Yeah. So it's rather crazy. Really quick, let me answer some questions about UBI since we're here. I have no problem doing it. So somebody said, does UBI cause inflation? Of course. I want you guys to understand inflation isn't inherently bad, right? Inflation doesn't mean we're going to die. A universal basic income in America would cause inflation for two reasons, right? One is because of the value-added tax that we would implement in order to like get the UBI, which is basically a tax of about 10% on like goods and services. Outside of things like, I believe it is like food and clothing are the only things that don't get taxed at this rate, right? Which is going to cause like inflation. Now, I would argue that most people, like, this would still be a net gain for everybody, because like, yeah, your costs go up by 10%. But if you're making minimum wage, if you're making $7.25 an hour, you're making like about $1,100 a month. So like, let's just say, for instance, that you like, let's say you make $1,100 a month and your spending is right on the dot. You spend all that money to live. So now, let's say your cost of living goes up. I think the projected inflation increase is like 6%, but let's just say your cost of living goes up 10%. So you're going from spending $1,100, making $1,100 a month, to spending $1,200, right? It's like $1,210, but let's just say $1,200. Who cares? Well, now you're making $2,100. So you've drastically benefited from this. The other way that this increases inflation, I'm going to go with this, like separate this arguments like two different things, is basically when it comes to if you're renting a property, landowners can like arbitrarily drastically boost your rent, or secondly, like the market would go up, right? So let's start with the market. Like, so like, let's say McDonald's prices would go up. Well, here's the thing. I would argue that in that case, the market would work itself out. Would McDonald's raise its prices? Probably for like the basic, for the UBI, sure. Would they potentially raise their prices because there's more money in the market? Yeah, sure. But a couple things. One, Trump's proved that more money in the market doesn't necessarily mean we're going to hit inflation, because he kept interest rates low his entire presidency, and we didn't see this drastic inflation problem. But also, McDonald's has competitors, and they're direct, instant competitors. So, like, if McDonald's decided to double their prices, Burger King's going to come in and say, well, you know what? I'm just not going to do that. I'm going to increase it, like, moderately, and this way you'll buy our product. So, like, I think the market would work itself out. This also has a profoundly positive impact on a lot of, like, food deserts, because you have more money going in there. So you'll see more food options in areas that don't have a lot of food options, because there's so much more money in the economy that they're going to gravitate to that area. So if you have an area that basically people are eating McDonald's, this just happens. Basically, the only thing that people can get to is a McDonald's. They can't get to a grocery store because they don't have the money for like a car. Public transportation system just doesn't exist. There's not a lot of options. This is going to bring options to that area. So in that sense, I would say it'll work itself out. When it comes to land ownership and like increasing, I think this is your best argument against UBI is like, well, what's stopping people like renting from increasing their wages, increasing the amounts who rent? And there are markets that don't have like a lot of competition. What I would say is that if you're only, and your best argument against why we shouldn't implement a universal basic income is because of greedy landowners, I think that maybe we need to focus more on the greedy landowners than not implementing a UBI. I would say we should implement a rent control law that tells people, like people who are renting, that they can't increase prices over like a particular amount. So it's like, hey, here's UBI. Also, if you own land, you can't increase rent by on like 10% in the first year, right? And then like 5% subsequently, whatever. You understand my point? Because like your only argument is like really greedy pieces of shit. That's why we shouldn't like have a huge solution that would drastically benefit all Americans. That's crazy to me. So yeah. If we give people UBI, they would quit their job. I don't think that that's a substantiated claim. I don't think that people that got $1,000 a month would outright quit their jobs. There's actually a study on the negative impacts of universal basic income. I forget specifically where they did it, but basically what they found was that the negatives were that people who lost their jobs would stay on unemployment longer, and that the desired work hours reduced per week by about 20%. That's really not that big of a deal. So basically people didn't want to work 40-hour weeks. They wanted to work 32-hour weeks instead, which as we move forward with technology displacing jobs is totally fine. Like if you're getting $1,000 a month and then the work week reduced to 30 hours a week for a lot of people, I think that would be, not everybody, but like, I think that that's a fine step. Like if McDonald's is like, I'm only going to hire you for 30 hours. Okay. Well, now you get $1,000 a month plus 30 hours of work a week. You have more time to develop your own hobbies. What technology should be a profound good for us. If we're basically getting to a point where we're at the Wall-E stage, right? Technology. What's the point of technology? What's the point of robotics? It's to offset our labor so that we as individuals have more time to chill, right? It's not for like capitalist overlords to make as much money as possible. It's supposed to be good for everybody. The point of life is to live. If you want a meaning of life, it is to live. And so, like, there's no reason why we shouldn't have reduced work weeks. Also, $1,000 a month is not enough to live, but like marginally. Here's the crazy thing. I don't think people are going to outright quit their jobs, right? It might happen. Maybe we could talk about state by state different UBIs. I don't think it's going to happen. But it will keep people out of the workforce longer, which, by the way, is the reason why we push kids into college, is to keep them out of the workforce longer. So, like, I don't really see this as an issue. I think a bigger thing that we need to focus on, rather than like, oh, who's going to try to live like very marginally on this, is instilling better work ethic in our young kids at a school level. Our schools are fundamentally flawed, and we should just teach kids to want to succeed and push better. And like, again, you can't live but like marginally on $1,000 a month, so I wouldn't worry too much about it. I should consider a presidential run. Yeah, sure. I got to get over all my cancellations first. And also, when it comes to the 40-hour work week, there are companies, I believe it's China or Japan, that are already they're testing cutting their work week down to 4 days a week, 8-hour days. And they haven't lost productivity. A lot of jobs, actually, I think it's estimated that people only work like 40% of their day. Some jobs you need somebody there at all times. Obviously, like McDonald's, you need people there at all times. But like a lot of jobs, you can perform quicker, and you could actually incentivize them being done more quickly by being like, hey, when you're done with quality work, you can leave, right? Would a VAT be added on top of? Yes, it would be added on top of sales tax. Do immigrants get UBI? For my universal basic income, if you're here, for my version of it, if you're here legally, you get a UBI. I'm totally fine with like people here on like whatever, a visa getting a UBI. Like I'm 100% fine with that. However, if you're here illegally, you wouldn't get a universal basic income. And honestly, part of my advocation for UBI is to disincentivize people coming here illegally. Because if you come here illegally, you don't get a UBI. It makes it more likely that you won't really come here. Now, two things added onto that argument. First and foremost, there are a lot of like immigrants here, or illegal immigrants, who actually do support our economy. So if it came down to it, and those people who like a lot of Americans are snooty fucks that won't wash dishes for like, you know, $5 an hour or $7 an hour or whatever. If it came down to it, and this caused like a disruption in our infrastructure, I honestly would just grant citizenship to people who were working here illegally, and then from that point on, be very aggressive about illegal immigration. However, I think that when it comes to people coming here, not even just most people who try to come here to seek asylum are do so for economic reasons. We give a lot of money to other countries, South and Central American countries are no different. Rather than support either kicking people out of the country or advocating for people to come into the country through asylum seeking, I think it's time for us to advocate potentially more money being given to Central and South America. Also on the idea that they have to stop fucking their citizens over, and we need to like basically get rid of the corruption in their government. America is very interested in changing regimes when it comes to Middle Eastern countries because there's oil, but we don't seem to give a shit about the people in countries that don't have resources that we can harvest. Another big positive to a universal basic income that you guys should understand is that there are a lot of workers nowadays who don't work traditional jobs. Uber Eats, Grubhub, any of these types of delivery taxi services, you don't get a minimum wage. You make whatever you are able to work. If you can work, you make money. If you can't, you can't. $15 an hour minimum wage doesn't help people who are unemployed, and it doesn't help people who work those types of jobs, right? Universal basic income absolutely does. There's so many positives to universal basic income, and I think people need to start thinking outside the box.